Appreciate everybody being here and appreciate you hanging in till the end. I'm as excited as I think everybody in this room by the CWD talk, so I really appreciate Minnesota folks coming down, sharing that out, and we look forward to working with them to help get a handle on this problem. So this is going to be a much more focused, less theoretical talk than Mike might have indicated of general deer ecology. This is looking at your feed tag and what can you learn about your feed with that and what it doesn't tell you. This is a first shot at this. This question had come up, about what can you learn from your feed tag? What does that really tell you? And I'm going to go through this pretty quick. And then what I would really love is if there's questions that you all have after this meeting later, that you would like to see addressed in this kind of presentation, let me know, because I think it's something that could lend itself to a management bulletin or some articles or something to get out in front of you, and so people can use these feed tags appropriately and know what it is they're learning from it. So one thing I learned out of this is that these feed labels are actually managed by an office. There's this office of the Texas State Chemist and this Association of American Feed Control Officials. And there's a whole manual that specifies how these feed labels need to be put together. And so that's why there's some consistency across those, which I think is important for a purchaser to be able to make a decision. And it states there that this label is to help people meet their production needs and should provide enough information that the purchaser knows what it is they're buying. So that's sort of the bottom line of it. And there's general feed or general layout here. I'll just go through this real quick. The label has to have a product name and a brand name. Has to have a purpose type statement. This one is to be fed to exotic game and deer in a natural environment. There's a list of guaranteed analyses. So this is kind of a shot at letting you know what nutrients are in there. An ingredient list. And then some feeding directions, which actually are often, they're there, but may not be particularly helpful. Basically, it says feed this and make sure the deer have enough water. And then some cautions and warnings, and a lot of these are, consult your local game laws and make sure that it's a legal thing to do. One other one that could be important here if you do have some other species of livestock in your property, particularly sheep, is a lot of times they'll put a warning on here that if you have sheep, do not feed this product where those sheep can get access to. And that's usually because it has high levels of copper. The deer are fine with it. It'll kill the sheep. So that's one of these warnings to keep an eye on. Have the manufacturer, distributor, and then the net weight of the package, whether that's a feed bag or it might just say bulk on there for delivery type stuff. So there's really two parts of this label that are probably need any attention or time. One is this guaranteed analysis, how to interpret that, and then this ingredients list. And I'm going to spend most of the time on this guaranteed analysis so that maybe you get a sense of what's on there and then maybe how to interpret it. So the first thing typically on this is a crude protein. I think everybody understands sort of this protein idea. And one thing I've done with several of these is I went in, found 18 different feeds produced in Texas, and for several of these different kind of nutrients, I've got an average and a minimum and maximum that I found on these feeds that I was able to chase down. So it'll give you a little idea of the kind of variation, breadth in some of these different feeds. So crude protein across these 18 bags was averaging 18%, range from 16 to 20, kind of typical stuff. We're not going to see this typically in deer foods, but a lot of times in livestock feeds, you might see this next one, equivalent crude protein from non-protein nitrogen. For a lot of livestock species, you can put a little bit of urea in the feed, and the bacteria in the rumen can convert that to protein. And so that urea actually has a protein value. You can convert that to a kind of a crude protein equivalent, and that needs to be listed if there's any urea in these feeds. Deer people aren't doing that. I never saw that on any of these feeds, and so I don't think that's something you'd run onto. Once in a while, you may see a specific amino acid listed and how much is there. Lysine is really the only one I think I saw listed on all these different bags. But one other thing, most of these are a minimum, so there'll be at least that much crude protein. There'll be at least that much, of a particular amino acid. A couple of these nutrients that might have a minimum and a maximum, so that you know the upper and lower limits. Bumping down to the next deal on this, crude fat. So this is, they basically soak the feed in some ether, extract everything that's soluble in that ether, which for the most part is fat. And fat can be important to know about. The thing is with pellets is that they really can't go to a very high level of fat in a pellet and still make a pellet. So this typically doesn't vary a lot. Across those 18 bags, or 18 different types of feed, 3.4% average, 1.8 to 6. And I even thought 6 was sort of on the upper end. I thought that might have been a bit over, but there were some things that looked like normal pellets that had a 6. And there are some other ways to get more fat in the feed, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But most of the kind of deer-type foods or typical pelleted feeds will be somewhere around 3% fat, something like that. Crude fiber, another can be an important one to look at. This idea of crude fiber is actually a throwback to an analysis that was developed back in the 1800s, and it's not a good analysis to use for the fiber in a deer food, but it's what the feed people use, and so we're stuck with it. It's the only thing that's going to show up on your label. They can, and on that list of things that are that can be allowed to be put on a feed label, you can use acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber, and those actually have some biologic meaning. Those can be good measures, but none of the bags I saw had it on it. So crude fiber is what we're stuck with, and what that is supposed to measure is what is indigestible in the food. And hang on to that idea, because that's going to be useful in interpreting the value of a feed. Crude fiber, and again, all 18 bags did list crude fiber, 14%, range from 7 to 20. So there's a fair amount of difference in there, and that does have some meaning in the value of a food. And like I said, we'll talk about that here in a minute, what that means. There's a whole variety of minerals that could be listed. Typically find calcium, phosphorus, salt is often listed, both as a minimum and maximum. And then there's other minerals that may or may not show up on the feed label. And I apologize for those of you in the back. I know you can't see the bottom, so I'll try to make sure I say what's on there. I'm going to go on to this next one. Well, actually, so there are a whole bunch of other minerals that may be on there, and I've put a little red underline under several others that are in the feed ingredient list but don't show up in the guaranteed analysis. So there's selenium, iron, manganese, another iron source, magnesium, zinc, an iodine source, cobalt, and potassium. So there's a whole bunch of other minerals in here that would show up in the guaranteed analysis, and you'd never know those are in there unless you looked at the ingredient list. And then the last kind of category that shows up on these feed labels are vitamins. And we've got vitamin A and E are often shown, not always, but if any vitamins listed, those are the two that are usually there. And one thing to let you kind of an interpretation, a lot of these ingredients are percentages. Some of the minerals, like zinc, is parts per million. And then these vitamins have this really funky unit. It's IU/LB. It's international units per pound. You might think, what the heck is an international unit? Well, the reason there's used this term international unit is vitamin A comes in many different forms. And depending on what form they have, let's say parts per million of vitamin A is going to be meaningless because some are really active as vitamin A and some have very low activity as vitamin A. You need a whole bunch of it to equal the same amount as one of these really active forms. So they have this kind of standardized way of talking about it, and it's an international unit. So no matter what form it goes in, you can talk about it in a standard way, even if different diets have different sources of this vitamin A, and the same thing with vitamin E. So that's why you'll see that kind of weird unit. And there's often other vitamins, just like with the minerals. So this particular feed has vitamin D, vitamin B12, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, thiamine, and biotin. So there's a whole bunch of other vitamins, and I'll talk a little bit about those here in a second and how you might think about them. So to back up just a little bit, calcium, phosphorus, they were listed as ingredients in all 18 of the kind of feed bags I looked at. You can see the percentages on average, minimum and max. And these are typically over what, at least in the literature, is listed as requirements for calcium and phosphorus for whitetail deer. So, there's a fair amount in there. Now, there's different sources, just like Peter was talking about in the last talk, depending on the source of the calcium and the source of the phosphorus, some are more available than others. And so it can get a little hard to interpret that. If we get down to, let's say, zinc, copper, and selenium, they weren't listed on all the bags. And actually, I guess salt is on here too. Salt wasn't listed on all the bags, but you can see the average values on there. I think if you get much above 25 or 50 parts per million copper, you could start having problems with sheep. And so you can see many of the deer feeds do have a level of copper that could be a problem if you've got sheep on the property. And I guess last thing I'll just mention, the selenium, a lot of people, they've heard about selenium, they hear about selenium toxicity. And there are some of the western states where selenium can be a problem. We're in an area where selenium isn't necessarily at toxic levels, and selenium actually has some really important functions in cell integrity, cell membrane integrity, and can help make animals less susceptible to the stress of let's say, capture or things like that. So selenium is a valuable thing to have in the feed, but it's needed at real small amounts. Just a fraction of a part per million really is where those are. And then vitamin A, vitamin E, large differences in this international units, 11,000 ranging from 3 to 20, vitamin E, 59 ranging from 20 to 350. So huge variation. Not a lot of danger in having too much of those. Vitamin A, if it is in an active form of the vitamin A, can be toxic. And a lot of times, though, it's going to be hard to know because the way it's often put here is vitamin A supplement. You don't know what form it's in. If it's in one of the forms that typically would come in a plant, it's not a problem because the deer convert it to an active form as they need it. But if it was put in an active form in the diet, there is some potential for, if the deer are eating a lot of it, to build up too much vitamin A. Vitamin E has some value also in addition to the deer benefit. It can help reduce oxidation of the fats in the pellet, and so it's an antioxidant in the deer and has that effect in the diet too. So there's maybe some other reasons for adding it. So that's all this guaranteed analysis stuff and a little bit of interpretation. And we've got this ingredients list. These ingredients lists are set up. There's some flexibility to give the producer the ability to use different ingredients depending on, let's say, market forces and be able to, if corn's available in one season and sorghum's available in another, they could switch those out. And so you'll often see this kind of collective feed term, so grain products. Doesn't really tell you what's in there, but it's going to be a grain product, and it's probably going to be corn or sorghum, and those both in the kind of nutritional sense serve a similar role in the pellet, but they don't lock themselves into using one or the other. They keep a little flexibility there. These ingredients are all listed in order of abundance, so the most abundant ingredient here, the grain products, plant protein products, things like maybe cottonseed meal or soybean meal are in there. Maybe other things, but again, they're leaving their options open for fulfilling that need. And then there's some others here. And one that you can kind of keep an eye on is this roughage products. These are some, they're going to be plant products that are going to be very poorly digested. So they're going to really contribute to that fiber level. And we'll talk here in just a second about why that would be something to keep an eye on. And then, these minerals and vitamins are listed individually, even though they don't necessarily have to show up on the guaranteed analysis part. So there's one characteristic of a food that isn't listed on this label, and it's one that if you've come to these meetings over the years, you might have a sense is probably important to the deer, and it's an energy level. There's nothing on there that tells you directly how much energy is in that food, but there's some hints that you could use to try to understand the energy value of the food. So I'm going to take just a second here and help you understand a little bit about how to interpret this. A lot of people, when they want to understand the energy level of food, they say, I need to do an analysis, and it's called a bomb calorimetry. And what it means, it just burns the food. So it's if you put a match to it, how much heat is released. And that is actually a very worthless measure of energy in a food, and I'll tell you why. Because the gross energy of this block of wood and the gross energy, let's pretend that's a baked potato, it's cooked. The gross energy of those they're going to be almost identical. It's not going to matter. If you burn that wood and you burn the same dry weight of a potato, it's going to be the same gross energy. So what affects the energy value? What affects the energy value is how much of that energy the deer can absorb and get into their body and use for its own metabolism. So if we took that block of wood and let's say we made sawdust out of it. I was going to use that sawdust picture at first. My wife goes, what the heck is that? I have no idea what that pile is. So I figured I'd start with a block of wood. So one of the big factors that's going to affect the energy value of a food to a deer is the digestibility. And so this DE is digestible energy. The digestible energy of this wood is, and I know exactly what it'd be, but let's just say it's half a calorie, kilocalorie per gram. It's really low. The deer's getting next to nothing out of that. If we look at the digestible energy in this potato, it's not all digestible, and who knows, in a deer it may be a little higher, but it's a lot better. So now we've got an understanding of the energy value of those two different materials. On the feed label, that crude fiber is our best estimate of kind of the digestibility of that food. And so if you've got more fiber, you have lower digestibility, lower digestible energy. This is going to have a high crude fiber value. This is going to have a really low crude fiber value. So you've got a little bit of way to interpret the energy value in these foods. There's one other thing that can influence it. Let's say we take that potato, and instead of doing a baked potato, we chop it up and we make fries. We take it and we dunk it in oil. We fry these things up, golden brown, beautiful. If you ever put them on your napkin, there's oil on those. So the fat does two things. It increases the gross energy of the food, which really isn't going to help us that much. So maybe this gross energy went up to 5 kilocalories per gram instead of 4.2. But that fat is typically really digested, and so it's also going to contribute to the digestible energy. And so maybe the digestible energy of this goes from 3.5 to 4.5. So now, because of this increased fat on these fries, we've got more digestible energy. And the reason is these carbohydrates and actually proteins, the cellulose, all those are around 4 kilocalories per gram. The fat is up around 9 kilocalories per gram. So fat has a lot more energy, and it's highly digestible. So that's why the fat level can be useful to look at. And then let's say we put some salt on our fries. That's a mineral. And there's absolutely no energy in a mineral. It adds weight, but it doesn't add any energy. So if you happen to have a really high level of, let's say, ash or mineral, that's going to have a low gross energy, and it'll have a low digestible energy. But typically the minerals don't add that much weight, and so that's probably not a real big deal to pay attention to. One last thing I want to mention, and this is not on the feed labels, but you see it in the kind of deer feed literature all the time. And as a trained wildlife nutritionist, I was never exposed to this term. It's an animal science term, and it comes from some of these analyses that were developed back in the 1800s. It's called total digestible nutrients. And it's got a really funky equation that I kind of understand, but biologically it makes no sense. There's actually maybe a better way to think about it. I'd almost think about it as an index. And it's an index that can range from 0, which makes sense, to over 100. And it's supposed to be sort of a percent, but you could have 110% total digestible nutrients. That makes no sense. That means the animal's digesting more than what was there. So that's why I say it's kind of a difficult term. But if you think about it in this term, it can be a useful concept. And so in a broad sense, you can take the digestible energy, divide it by 4.4, multiply it by 100. What it is, it's kind of the percent of the digestible energy in a typical food the percent of the energy in a typical food that's digestible. And so, if we put this 4.5 in here, that would be total digestible nutrients of 4.5 divided by 4.4 times 100. It's like 102. So the total digestible nutrients would be 102% for that potato with the, that had been fried up in some oil. And you could figure out what those others are. I think the 0.5, the block of wood is 0.5 divided by 0.44. That's like 10% total digestible nutrients. So anyway, maybe that'll help you interpret this TDN value if you ever run onto it. So just a couple of quick other kind of follow-ups here. In the literature, calcium, phosphorus, requirements are going to vary tremendously depending on the sex of the animal, the age of the animal, the season, all kinds of things, but maybe varying between 1.5 to 0.5 phosphorus. There's actually some similar values for requirements. But in a diet, there's kind of an optimal ratio, and you'll see this in most of the feeds, a 2-to-1 ratio, twice as much calcium as phosphorus. And if you get down to 1-to-1, that's probably still okay. If you start varying from those ratios a lot, you get less calcium than phosphorus, or you get, let's say, 6 or 8 parts calcium for 1 part phosphorus, they can start competing for absorption, and you can get some poor nutrition, deficiency symptoms out of that. Sodium, copper, zinc, et cetera, down. there's really no published requirements on all those micronutrients. Some people may know some things, but it's not, I haven't been able to find it in the literature, so really don't know how to interpret what's a proper level. I just don't know that. This harkens back to the CWD presentation. Not all the minerals are the same, and these chelated minerals do have higher absorption and may be handled differently in the body than some of the, I'm going to call them inorganic forms of these minerals. And one way to know if there's a chelated form, you might see an amino acid term on it. You might see complex, lysine and methionine. You might see, like a zinc methionine or a zinc amino acid complex or something like that. That's some of these chelated forms of the minerals. And so you at least have some idea that was a source of those particular minerals. The vitamins, two different forms of vitamins. There's fat-soluble, which are the vitamins A, D, E, and K. Vitamins A and E are found in abundant green vegetation. I don't think there's any reason why, if there's good forage and green stuff out there, why we would expect to have deficiency problems in vitamin A and E. They can be stored in the liver, so even if you get in a drought, the deer are going to have access to some additional vitamin A and E over time until they run out of those. But they also don't hurt to put in the feed, and so they can be a good buffer. And there may be some stressful situations and different things that would help the deer to have those in their feed. These are some of the terms that you might see associated with vitamin E. These tocopherols or carotenoids or retinoids are two different kind of general categories of vitamin A sources. Vitamin D, you'll see that in the feed. It can be useful. It helps the animal regulate calcium in its body. It is produced naturally by the body with exposure to sunshine, so whether that can be limiting in a free-ranging deer, be a little hard to say. Vitamin K, you won't see that added. It is produced by the gut microbes and just typically wouldn't be a problem. All the other water-soluble vitamins, a lot of the feeds I looked at have those added. Those water-soluble vitamins are made by gut microbes. Now, whether the gut microbes are making enough to meet the deer's needs or not, there's some kind of mixed evidence on that, but typically most people don't think of ruminants needing the water-soluble vitamins. I think they're cheap and easy to add, but may not be necessary all the time. Two other real quick sort of categories of feed labels. Here's a feed label that has 7 or 8% calcium, 4 phosphorus, 45 to 50% salt. That's a very different feed label than what we looked at before. There's no crude protein, no fiber. These are mineral supplements. And so, they've got some very different things in them and very different concentrations of all these different minerals than we saw in the protein or pelleted type feed. One other type of feed that it would be good to keep an eye on, here's one, 14% crude protein, that kind of makes sense, 30% crude fat. I told you if you get up around even above 6%, you can't make a pellet. This one here, 12% crude fat, that's high. These are not a typical pelleted feed, they're an extruded feed. They're more like they're made more like a dog food that can have high fat levels in them. Probably not things you'd want to feed free choice out there necessarily, but may have a role in your program. And they're going to be high energy. This one not only has 30% fat, but it has 7% crude fiber, real low crude fiber. So it's going to be a very energy-dense food. So here's one other, just to get you thinking a little bit. 14% crude protein, 2% fat, 21% crude fiber, and the first product on it is a roughage product. The most abundant thing in that diet is a fiber product. Why in the heck would anybody make that diet? So this is a diet we made working with the Kerr Wildlife Management Area to try to get a low energy diet. And the feed company we were working with said if we went any more roughage products, we'd burn our feed mill down because the heat of trying to pump this thing through is going to cause problems. So I don't know if that was true, but that's what they told us. So this is as high a fiber diet as they would make us, and it's worked for the particular study we were making it for. So anyway, I appreciate you hanging in here till the end and sharing this out. And again, I'd love any feedback that you have of things that this didn't answer or things that weren't clear, and help us kind of refine this message for the future. So, Mike, I'll turn it back over to you.
Any questions for Dr. Hewitt? Yeah, Mike. So if
energy is typically limiting, right, in South Texas? True?
Mm-hmm.
Can you take your feed and get the digestible energy tested?
Yes, you could. And the easiest way to do it would be to have a couple of these other fiber analyses run on it, and then there's some equations that do a pretty good job of predicting how digestible it is. And once you know how digestible it is, the digestible energy is very easy to calculate. So yes, there are ways of doing that.
Would you recommend that to make sure that your particular feed brand is delivering, this limiting nutrient?
Right. So I'm going to put it this way. If you look at the fiber values, and certainly with this detergent fiber, the foods that deer eat have a lot of fiber in them. If you look at the fiber values that we've run on the pelleted feed that we've done, it's really low compared to the foods that deer eat. And so in general, I think even though everybody calls them protein pellets, they are a high energy diet.
So in other words, we don't have to worry about it.
No, some feeds may have more than others, but relative to what the deer would normally be eating, I think all the pelleted feeds that I saw, with the exception of our research diet, actually are good in energy. Okay.
Any other questions for Dr. Hewitt?
Yeah.
How much fat can be utilized by deer relative to what's in the pellet?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just like Jacob said, when we don't know, that's what we're going to answer. So if the deer is eating a really high-fat item, and they do eat some high-fat items. There's acorns, there's different things that actually have a fair amount of oil in them. That high fat, the rumen has a hard time handling all that at some level, and so the deer need to back off on how much they're eating, and they'll do it naturally. They're not going to make themselves feel totally raunchy by eating a whole bunch of acorns. They're going to go out and start mixing some other stuff in. So what that level is, I don't know. I don't know what it is, and you could feed that 30% fat, kind of deer food that was listed on there, and the deer would not, I'm going to guess they would not be able to live on that. That would be too much for that fat for them to be able to eat enough of that food to get everything they needed. But if it's fed in a situation where they can eat some of that and then other stuff, it's great, and they'd figure out, kind of how much they could eat. The pelleted feeds, I think the amount of fat they can put into a pellet is not going to overload the deer's fat level. It's when you get to these extruded feeds, I think that you'd have more problem with that. We did some work years ago with cottonseed, and the deer limited themselves at about 40% of their diet cottonseed and about 60% of the alfalfa that we'd offered them. And we were thinking that was maybe a gossypol type effect, this chemical that's in cottonseed. But after I got thinking about it, I was almost wondering if that wasn't a fat effect, and they had to back off, and that's as much as they were willing to eat, because they would start messing up, their rumen environment if they got too much fat. So whether that was the case or not, I'm not sure. So bottom line is we don't know, but as long as deer have options, and Pancho's talk emphasized the importance of diversity, I think the deer can put that together. It's the pen situations where it can get real tricky. Great. Thank you.